It's amazing the amount of people that have turned up. So, first of all, thank you for coming. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dave as he gives his talk on his new book, Pit Folk and Peers. There were a lot of tears as well, I think.
Freudian slip.
Yeah, right. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Well, amazing is not the word for it, folks. I'm astonished. I'm looking round for packets of confetti, and I think there's a wedding reception in here as well, isn't there? I can bless you, but I can't marry you, I'm afraid. But I'll do my best. As Angela has just said, I'm here to talk about Pit Folk and Peers. In fact, I'm talking about both volumes simultaneously. You can read one without the other, but I'd advise anyone to read both, because they chart what is, in my opinion, and I'm certain of it, the remarkable history of Fryston and its surrounds. I'll let you into a little disguised secret, which was that we were initially to have this reception and book launch at the Castleford Heritage Trust Centre, which would have made for a very, very fine setting. But you don't know how appropriate it is, how fulfilling it is for me to come here, partly because it resonates with earlier phases of my life, but also it's got that particular intersection of key themes in the book. It brings together the mining part, as many of you will know already, if not I'm going to explain, and the aristocratic part as well. Now, in true commercial style, and you'll see that I've got the editor of Revd who's taking pictures of me at the moment. In true style, there's a commercial imperative here, which is to publicise the book. I'm just concerned that people will read it, because I've got an emotional investment. My identity is invested in that book, and I hope by the end of it to convince people, need you be convincing, that your identities are in there. What I want to do is give little tantalising excerpts from the book, or its main points. What I want you to do then is to read it, not just because of the commercial imperative, as I said, but also because I think it'll be so fulfilling. It'll tell you who we are. I include myself in that. Who we are, not just the people of Fryston, Airedale, Townville, not just the people of Castleford, but people from mining communities everywhere. I'm going to talk about Fryston. I'm going to uphold it as a quintessential mining community. But one of the biggest and most pleasant surprises of my life was the value of the aristocratic heritage as well from Fryston Hall, and I want to dwell on that. But I've alluded to the main point of this today. What I want to do is I want to say how that book, how the heritage that it contains, and I see heritage as something that we're building on all the time, and this is my small contribution to what is a marvellous heritage, that it's there on record. I want people afterwards to talk about it, to build on it, to go on their websites, etc. That's my foremost ambition. But what I want to do, I want to say, in all conceitedness, when I went to university, I never took a backward step. I'd got a sense of who I was. The identity that I got deriving from my Fryston roots, Castleford, Airedale, etc., sustained me. It gave me confidence, pride, inspiration. What I really want today and afterwards, and as a result of reading that book, is to share that sense of pride and inspiration. Not only that, to pass it on to the next generation. We've had a good kicking in this area recently, last 40 years in fact. But there's a heritage there. We've got generations at the back of us and in front and present day that are a match for anything. I want to establish that. I want to begin by saying, last time I was here was 2.5 years ago. I stood about there, and it was for my Auntie Dora's funeral service. She was 1 month shy of being 101. And she lived at Dorothy Street, but for the first 45 years of her life, she was a Frystoner. During the pandemic, we talked about nothing. I phoned her every night, we talked every night, largely for my sake, if I'm honest. We talked every night, and we talked about Fryston. Names that came up, you know, Cuddy Bates and the Butcher, like that. Legends to me now. But they're like best friends, and they're in the book. That was Dora's funeral. Previous occasion that I remember anyway was 10 years ago, and it was my dad's funeral. And there's where I want to start the story. My dad, Pete Waddington, many of you will know him. He lived within 100 yards of here, 199 Fryston Road, just the other side of Royds Avenue. He lived there with his brother Melvin, who worked all his life at Fryston. Their dad, my granddad, was Tom Hutchinson Waddington. He worked at Airedale, came from Lock Lane, got the house on Fryston Road. His dad before him, my great-granddad, was a bloke called George Waddington, worked at Holland Bywater, blown up at the Somme, blown to pieces at the Somme. On my dad's mother's side, Maud Edith Waddington, her father was a miner, came up from Staffordshire. So we're starting to get that sort of idea that mining in general is endemic to my identity, heritage. But it's Fryston. It's the village of Fryston that I want to dwell on. My roots, Fryston. Really start in 1901 when the guy in the uniform there, Samuel Holmes, my granddad, my mum's dad, came up from Shropshire. His dad had been a miner. All his older brothers were a miner, and there were lots of them. And they came up, and they got a house without the dad. He stayed, he was a bit ill, he stayed. They came via Nottinghamshire, but he's still in Nottinghamshire, Colville. And they moved into Hope Street on Fryston. Sam joined the pit a couple of years later, could neither read nor write, but he entered the mines. And it was at that point, shortly afterwards, that he met my grandma. My grandma hailed from Whitwood. Her side of the family made glass bottles, but she lived with her older sister and brother, who was a miner at Fryston. Now, in due course, they started courting, got married. Grandad went to war, came back, and it was at that point they got married. My oldest auntie, Elsie, came along. Then Dora, who I've just talked about, in 1922. It was at that point, things got a bit crowded. They lived in Oxford Street, the famous back-to-back buildings, the low buildings as they were called, just opposite the pit entrance. It got crowded. One day, my grandma went stomping up the steps to the manager's office at Fryston. Now, she was a shy, demure woman. She went in and said, "Well," the manager said, "What can I do for you, Mrs. Holmes?" She says, "You promised." "I promised you what?" She says, "You promised me the first house that became available in the village was ours." And he says, "But Mrs. Holmes," says, "it's Brook Street. It's the deputy's row. It's officials up there. Sam, you know, with the best vessel in the world, is an ordinary miner." She says, "Don't you preach at the Wesleyan?" She says, "Are you a hypocrite or what?" She says, "You're going to have to throw me out." She says, "You're going to have to do it because none of these blokes will lay a hand on me. I promise you." So looking at this sort of 4'11" ball of fury, she reached up, key, you start paying rent on Monday. That's how they got Brook Street. Now, 2 kids already. They had another 7 up on Brook Street. 2 died in infancy. A third was actually farmed out to one of my grandma's sisters, adopted by one of my grandma's sisters, because she couldn't afford to raise him. So that left another 6 at Brook Street. My mum was the youngest. That's where she lived. Got to about 1955, 1956. A thing happened of great relevance to my life. Terry Templeman tells the story. He says, I was talking to him about a book which I'll come on to in a minute, and Terry says, I know, Dave, he says, I know the exact moment when the father first came onto the man. They started courting. He says, coming back on a bus from Ponty, we'd been playing football. He said, the dad usually was at the back holding court, showing off to everybody. This time he went forward and showed off to a big woman with dark hair. He said, the man Mary. She usually got off at the Magnet, went all the way down Fryston Road, got off at the bottom there, followed us to the bridge, and according to Terry, he turned back then just in case my granddad clapped eyes on him, which he didn't. My mum took up the story. She said, David drove me mad. She says, he'd already started at the pit. She says, but somehow contrived a situation every week where I'd get off with it and he'd be waiting. Same old story, 30 yards away, I knew it was him, pocket comb. Tony Curtis hairdo, making sure everything was in place. Then he'd use the charm on me, follow me all the way to the bridge, tried to kiss me, I'd push him away, and that. But that charm must have worked, because by the end of 1956, my mum was pregnant with me. They got married on 24th of December 1956, and they got a belated Christmas present 2 months later when I popped out. The picture I'm about to show you, that's Tony Curtis. The bloke who looks a bit like Kirk Douglas in the Vikings is me, the baby there. Now, that is me a year and so bit later, effigy of Donald Duck in the pushchair. And you'll notice, you'll say, well, where's Mary in all this? Well, there are 2 reasons why not. One is that she was in hospital, in and out of hospital. Having me, for some reason, made her poorly, probably sick of the sight of me, but never mind. Made me poorly. And I was raised to a great extent by my Auntie Dora, who I've just mentioned. And I was born above those windows, the back bedroom, and we lived there when I was a toddler. And I remember Joan Armstrong's in here. Joan and her parents, George and Min, lived on one side, Edie Dalton and Cyril on the other. They used to have a boxer in there. And the boxer, I remember this as a kid, they called him Peter Cobbler. He was a Ghanaian. And he bought me a pair of gloves. He was a professional. Bought me a pair of gloves, and he used to stick his chin out, and I used to chin him one, and he used to fall on his back. I remember Donald Duck. I remember it round. But when it became unsustainable, we moved out. A lot of Fryston people did. There was a new estate, Colboard Estate, Shepherd's Estate, that we lived on. I lived till I was about 17 on there. But we moved up there. One of my uncles, my mum's brother, already lived there. One of her sisters already lived there. And there were people that used to get confusing because I know them by one name, but my mum always referred to them by their Fryston name. Dot Spedding, Mary Spedding. There was Paynes, there were Aspreys, Dora Templeman. And these were old Frystons. It was like a little Fryston up there as well. And I remember a couple of times we still went down what was the spiritual home, Brook Street. Stayed in Brook Street. And when my grandma fell ill, my granddad died in 72. When my grandma fell ill shortly around that time, she came and lived with us for 2 years. But we kept the house on Brook Street, paid the rent. The idea was always that we'd go back and take on the house after my grandma had died. But it never happened because of waiting lists and things like that. But it was at Shepherd's where I passed my 11 plus and went to what was then Colville Technical High School. I hated it. First 3 or 4 weeks I hated. You'd go in and I'll put it like this, I was a soft kid in a hard case's body. And by God, the teachers knew that. And someone in the art class would go, and he'd say, "Was that you, Waddington?" And I'd say, "No, are you arguing back?" Detention, 500 lines. Wasn't blow raspberries in the arts class. And what was kind of adding to that sense of alienation was the stiffness of the place. I wasn't prepared for the fact that you went into houses that were named after inventors and, you know, famous men, always men. Faraday, Davy, Ostler, Smeaton. And we're on Crewe Road. And with hindsight, nobody said, why was it called Crewe Road? Let alone, why didn't we call the houses after someone relating to our own heritage? No, Davy, okay, but the rest of them. And we never told that. In the history, we did about Castleford in the Roman era, but not, you know, nothing to do with mining. Did something about Ixon and Welsh, I seem to remember. Not much about mining. But by the time I got to about 14, 15, there was a political awakening. Mr. Scargill had come onto the scene. The miners were having their strikes, and we were starting to reevaluate, reconsider what it meant to be mining and members of mining communities, come from mining roots, and we took a more assertive pride in ourselves. And this was consolidated. It's not happening. Oh, there we are. It was consolidated just before I went to university, 1975. Read a book, and there was a BBC serialisation by the great socialist director Ken Loach called Days of Hope, and it followed the lives through the Great War, 1914 to 18, strikes of the early 20s, and the general strike and lockout where the miners were betrayed by the trade union movement. And I thought, not just because Paul Copley, the lead actor, looked a bit like him. I thought, this is the story of my grandmother and granddad. This is my story. And I went into Castleford Library before I went to university, and I covered this period and started bringing. So that was the start of me gathering in the heritage. And I went to university, and when I had learned that I could do a PhD, I decided to do it on the subject of strikes, and this was a direct line back to the miners' strikes of the 70s. And that kick-started an entire career since then, where one after another thing, it's been about the policing of the miners' strike. It's been about communities, how they struggled after the miners' strike. It's about the effects of pit closure. It's about privatisation of the industry, the regeneration of the coalfield, non-regeneration of the coalfield areas. All this has been sort of partly autobiographical, partly selfish in a way, me studying mining communities, the mining industry, the fate of the aforementioned. And every now and again, I stepped off. On one day, my mum brought me through a newspaper cutting. It said that. You see Jack Hume's on there. Jack Hume became a good friend. Cut my hair when I was 4 apparently, but I don't remember it. But it said on there, it says, is closure of pit village death knell? And I thought, what if it is? I want to do something about it. So, although I was working, and I'd got a heavy lecturing load in Sheffield, where I was teaching at the time, I'd nip across to Airedale, Fryston, Glasshoughton, Swillington, talk to people, did 60 odd interviews, and Rush released a kind of little book called One Road In, One Road Out. Some of you may have seen it. I don't even have a copy myself, but I spread it around. We gave most of them away. We also took a video camera around, talked to certain people, and we produced Rush again. I was an amateur, I didn't know one end of a camera from the other. Editing suite, made it up as we went along, did a video. But we got something on record. And I've got all those transcripts, and I've been calling on them in the course of writing this book. Now, the second time was around 2010. My dad was starting to get poorly, depressed, and we later discovered it was vascular dementia. One of the things that he always talked about was his football. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice? 1963, he was captain of the Fryston County Cup winning side when they beat Fackley against the odds. And I thought, I'm going to commemorate that. I like my football, I'm going to commemorate. So I went round, talked to all the players on both sides, and Angela will know because she helped me. I went into the Pontefract Library and I was on the microfiche all the time and put together this book. And that was part of the heritage. But even in the course of doing the research for that, I was pulling things out. I was pulling articles out of a fire, during the First World War. Of a fatality here and there. So that I was having a sneaky look and I was killing two birds with one stone. And I always knew that eventually I was going to go back and write something more telling, because this was making me even more proud of my heritage. And I wanted others to share it. Now, this bloke on here, and who he represented, I've got to tell you, I was all ready to give him a good kicking. I thought, so you were the people who exploited mine, eh? You were the people who made off with the profits. You were the people who had them enslaved. You had the women as a life of drudgery. And to boot, you had the largest collection of erotica in Europe. And I thought, pervert, I'm having you. But it changed. It changed. This guy who used to be Richard Monkton Milnes, later Lord Houghton, lived at Fryston Hall, synonymous with Fryston Hall. In my estimation, a man in a million. He was, as I started to discover more earnestly, excuse me, I'm going to have to drink a hot chocolate. Started out as an MP, then he entered the House of Lords. He was a reformist politician. True, he frequented Soho flagellation brothels. He was broad-minded. I'll forgive him that. But he was a social reformer. He was in favour of better working conditions in the factories, in the mines. He wanted free libraries. He wanted free education for the masses. He wanted home rule. He sympathised with the rural poor of Ireland. He had a distaste for the monarchy and what they represented. He was open to different ethnicities, different cultures. He explored them, made a point of it. But he was a great philanthropist as well. And anybody, the poorer the poet, the more downtrodden the novelist, the more he helped them. Gave most of his fortune away. Fryston Hall, by the same token, was the receiving house for practically anyone. I once said to my brother, I said, Paul, think of somebody in Victorian England. Monkton Milnes knew them as a friend, and it's more likely than not they were visitors to Fryston Hall. It was the greatest social hub outside of London. And it also got a house in London, so it didn't miss anybody in London anyway. But Tennyson over there on the left, poet laureate, Monkton Mills had him as a visitor. He also arranged for him, because Tennyson didn't have much brass to call on, he arranged for him to have a pension. Swinburne there, a sort of up-and-coming poet, Mills helped transform him to one of the greatest poets in the English language. Disraeli came to Fryston Hall on a couple of occasions, as did Lord Palmerston and other eminent politicians of the day. Now, one person who I can find no record of coming to Fryston Hall, but Mills courted her for 2 years. Proposed marriage to her, Florence Nightingale, the Lady of the Lamp. Mills said, "Will you marry me?" Florence had just had a calling from God saying, "You're going to have to act in my service." So it was Monkton Mills or God. And I don't want to be disrespectful to the latter, but she was on the point of choosing Monkton Mills, little did he know. And he was getting fed up after 2 years, and he thought, she's going to go to the Crimea, right? And there's another woman who's after me, called Annabel, and he chose to pursue her. And the letters subsequently disclosed by the likes of Florence Nightingale's sister showed that she was on the point of accepting his hand in marriage. Now, no hard feelings. What he did, true to form, he set up the Nightingale Foundation in her name, so that other nurses could be trained and paid for, their training paid for. And they remained friends for the rest of their lives. One thing that I should add, Monkton Mills, in contradistinction from other MPs and peers of the day, when it was the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, Mills was only one of 5 prominent politicians throughout the land who supported the Union side rather than the Confederacy. There is a reason why Confederacy was so popular. The Union had put an embargo on cotton sales coming out of the southern states of America, the Confederate states, and it was affecting places like Bradford and Manchester, the cotton and textile industries of those places. Mills appealed to a higher value. He said, "I'm opposed to slavery. There should be no slaves on this earth." And he took in the American minister, Charles Francis Adams, brought him to Fryston Hall, brought friends around him and what have you, gave him hospitality, where he was shunned by the rest of British society. When he went to America, when Mills and his son, future Lord Crewe, went to America, he was called by the then president, the former commander of the Union Army, Ulysses S. Grant, for an audience to thank him. Better still, when President Grant finished his 3rd term of office as president, did a kind of concluding tour of the European countries, got off the boat at London, and he made a point of visiting 3 people only. Queen Victoria, the Prince of Wales, future Edward VII, and Richard Monkton Mills. And true to form, because he'd got a mischief about him and he liked to put people together at parties who were sort of a bit dissimilar, who might spark off each other, he sat General Grant, President Grant, next to Lily Langtry, the actress, who was the mistress of Edward VII. And that was his nature, mischievous but benevolent to a T. Now, equally important, he had two daughters and a son. The daughter, Florence Ellen, eventually married an army captain called Arthur Henniker, who was decorated in the Boer War. But she became a novelist in her own right. She did 6 or 8 novels and plays. But she's equally famous because, for reasons which I'll explain in a minute, she became the love interest, unrequited I must say, of the great novelist Thomas Hardy, Far From the Madding Crowd and all that. But while they were both married, Hardy pursued her. She never sort of fell under his charm, you know, and polite. They remained friends, and she was his mentor for years afterwards. But it never came to fruition. But if you look at Hardy's poems, then there's a scattering of dedications, implicit dedications, to Florence Henniker, Monkton Milnes' daughter. And if you read the pages by common consent, if you look Jude the Obscure, then the central female character, Sue Bridehead, is cast in the image of Florence Milnes Henniker. But it was an unrequited love. Now, the reason she met Thomas Hardy was on account of her brother. Her brother married a man called Sybil. They had 3 daughters together who were all raised at Fryston Hall. But Sybil died of scarlet fever. And they started to spend more time at Crewe. Crewe because Monkton Milnes' wife, also called Annabel, was the sister of the then Lord Crewe, who owned massive estates and a massive fortune in sort of Staffordshire and Cheshire. When he died, Annabel already being dead, Lord Crewe inherited the land and the fortune, became a very wealthy man. And he embarked on a kind of ambassadorial career. First of all, it took him and the girls, his 3 girls, we'll come on to talk about it in a bit, to Ireland, where he was Viceroy of Ireland. That was like the Queen's proxy. She wasn't very popular with the Irish, old Victoria. She sent Crewe, and guess what? He wasn't too popular either. And one of the reasons why he got this reputation, be a handsome fella by all accounts, very eligible, but very stiff, very straight-laced, very aloof. The Irish didn't take to him. The Protestant sort of fraternity and the rich in the north all suspected what he was about because he was a professed Home Rule for Ireland proponent. By the same token, the Catholics saw him as a bit aloof and, you know, demeaning of them, etc. So what he used to do was, he used to hold these lavish balls where nobody from Ireland turned up. And he was dependent on the patronage of people like Henry James, the American novelist who also came to Fryston years ago, and people like Thomas Hardy. That's where they met. Now, Crewe married again, and he married the woman there who left. She was closer in age to his daughters, actually, but they called her Peggy Primrose. She was the daughter of perhaps the most famous and best loved Liberal politician of all time, Lord Rosebery, and Lord Rosebery's wife, who was Hannah de Rothschild. She was an heiress from the famous Rothschild, the Jewish banking family, one of the richest and most influential families in Europe. You can conclude that he wasn't short of a bob or two. But he embarked on a political career, Lord Crewe. And it was one of these careers where it was stymied by the fact he wasn't a great speaker. A bit like George VI, he had a pronounced stammer. He was a shy man publicly, and he droned on. But he was widely regarded as one of the great political sages of the early 20th century. Everybody went to him. He was the right-hand person in the last Liberal government led by Asquith, who made him Minister of the Colonies and then Minister of India. And it was Crewe who, because of his demeanour, because of his aloofness and what have you, never quite cut it as a leader, political leader. But backstage he was phenomenal. But it was Crewe who engineered the situation, talking to royalty. And he was friends with all the royals. You know, in 1896, for example, he famously invited the future king, Edward VII to Fryston, where the king used it as a base to go to the St. Leger, where his horse romped home in the Doncaster St. Leger. And they went out famously on a shooting expedition. And the king peppered the backside of all the Fryston grouse beaters who were around the hall. But Crewe, as I say, not a leader, but a shaker, a mover and a shaker. And he engineered a situation where the House of Lords veto, whereby they could step in and say to the House of Commons, you're not passing that act over our dead body, and it would die a death. He reduced the powers of veto. He arranged single-handedly for George V and Queen Mary to go on an expedition to India. It was a time when British prestige in India was on the wane, when the royalty were considered a bit disdainfully by the Indian population as a whole. Crewe set up this tour of India, which was so successful that millions came out, and the prestige and position of the monarchy in India was reconsolidated. But he'd got his failings as well. Unlike his dad, who followed his gut and was a conviction politician, Lord Crewe always thought, what's best for the empire? What's best for the nation? Not what is right and proper. What is best for the nation? And a very famous person called Gandhi called on him and said, have you seen what they're doing? Gandhi was pro-British at the time. He'd got his legal papers in London, as a student in London. And very pro-British. Came to Lord Crewe as Minister of India and he said, listen, have you seen what the South Africans are doing to the migrant Indian labour? It's appalling. Can you do something about it? He said, I sympathise. So you'll do something good. And a few years later he came with a similar request, and on both occasions Crewe promised something, but then saw Gandhi the next time and said, I'm sorry, we can't hack off the South Africans, they're too important. And in a way that was instrumental. It turned the tide of Gandhi's ideological position, because he said, so this is the British for you, is it? This is what they really think about the Indians. And he was already engaging in passive resistance, etc. And he went home from the second meeting with Lord Crewe on the steamship back to India, saying, we're going to do something about this. And that, in a way, was the beginning of the overthrow of British rule in India. Now, one thing about Lord Crewe was, again, he had daughters. He had 3 daughters. He had a son who died, unfortunately. I'll come on to that later on. He had got 3 daughters. They carried the sort of family tradition on in a way. This is Cynthia Colville. Colville, her married name. She was someone who almost became, she was very left-wing in her views, she almost became an MP for the London Borough of Shoreditch. Why? Because she'd gone in there as a charity worker, then as a volunteer, then as a trained social worker, to help out the impoverished families, to help overcome the high rate of child mortality, what have you. She eventually rose to the position of chair of various boards. And like her, that sort of campaigned for better conditions in the East End among the poor. Like her stepmother, because Lord Crewe remarried, as I said, Peggy. They did a lot for women's trade unions, unemployed women. They paved the way for women legal trainees to enter the male-dominated legal profession. They were among the first female JPs, and they were trailblazing in that regard. So they did a lot. The second of Lord Crewe's daughters, and there were three, someone called Annabel, named after the mother. She's more famous, rather, for who she married than the children they had. She got married initially to someone called Arthur O'Neill, who was from a very rich Protestant family, owned Shane's Castle in Northern Ireland. Now, she married him. He was the MP, he was a soldier, but he was also MP for Mid-Antrim. Very rich, wealthy family. He has the unfortunate distinction of being the first MP to be shot dead in the First World War. They'd already had 5 children together. She subsequently remarried someone called Hugh Dodds, who was an ambassador. They had 2 more children together. That was by Crewe's first marriage. His second marriage to Sybil produced this young woman, a societal beauty called Mary. They'd also had a brother for Mary, but he unfortunately died aged 11, very suddenly, very mysteriously, of a sort of undiagnosed illness. But Mary, she was the godparents of Queen Mary and George V. She moved in high circles, and one of them involved this guy, the 9th Duke of Roxburgh, who owned this sprawling, opulent Scottish estate. She married him. But the guy went and committed adultery. But as Scottish law dictated, it was his prerogative not to say, sorry, here's half of my income, but get out of my house, I'm no longer interested. So she very famously barricaded herself into a wing and stayed there, literally put things against the door so him and his bailiffs couldn't get in. Local aristocrats came to her rescue. Very famous man, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, who became the Prime Minister of England in the early 1960s, Tory politician, smuggled her in food and clothing and fuel for the fire. And eventually, the 9th Duke gave way, came to a settlement, and Mary moved, and this is important for a future reference, Mary moved then to West Horsley Place in Surrey, which was owned as part of the Crewe family estates. So just hold on to that thought while I move on. Two of Crewe's daughters by Sybil, Cynthia and Annabel, had children, had boys. The guy on the left there is someone called Jock Colville. He was private secretary to 3 consecutive British Prime Ministers. He was at the Foreign Office, but he was appointed. Didn't have to sort of go for an interview. He was Lord Crewe's, grandson, for goodness sake, And he was called to be private secretary, Harold Macmillan, Winston Churchill, Clement Attlee. And then when Churchill was re-elected in the mid-50s, Churchill again. He's with Churchill. During the second term of office, Churchill called him over. There was something wrong. His face had collapsed. He said, and his physician says, he's had a stroke. Churchill beckoned him forward. He says, you're going to have to take over. He says, take over what? You should take over the running of the country. So, informally and unconstitutionally, with the help of Churchill's nephew, the collusion of the press barons who were called and owed it to Churchill and said, listen, we're not going to disclose anything of this in our papers. Jock Colville ran the country for a week. Unconstitutionally, illegally. He was a de facto Prime Minister. The literal Prime Minister is the guy on the right. You remember I said Annabel initially married into the O'Neill family. This was the youngest of the 5 children, a guy called Terence O'Neill. He rose to the position of Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. It was his misfortune that he was cut from the same cloth as his grandfather, Lord Crewe. The Protestants on one hand didn't like him, they thought he was selling out. The Catholics didn't like him, they thought he was too patronising, he didn't get on with anyone. He tried to rush through unpopular decisions, and guess what? The troubles in Northern Ireland reached an unprecedented peak, with water mains and electricity supplies and explosions and the army being called in, and he resigned. The guy at the bottom on the right was a guy called Quentin, who was a product of the second marriage. He was originally Quentin Dodds. The family changed their name to Crewe. He was more like, in his nature, more like Richard Monkton Mills than anybody on earth. So that he got this mischievous way through these lavish parties. Everybody wanted to be near him. He represented, he was a journalist to begin with, he represented the poor and downtrodden. He wrote articles exposing the lives and the fate of South Africans in apartheid, of the gypsy community in Britain. He became a very well-known restaurant critic and travel editor. Very well known. What was unfortunate about him was that, as you can possibly see from there, he got MS, which was a progressive disease. And his best friend, Lord Snowdon, husband of Princess Margaret, developed a chairmobile for him. And they were on very friendly terms. They were best friends. He and his wife, Angela, were best friends with Snowdon and Princess Margaret. So they rubbed shoulders with royalty. Lavish parties where the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the great playwrights and actors and actresses of the day came, and they literally sat round his feet because he was a magnificent storyteller. And there's a chapter in the book, and I've called it A Chip Off the Old Block. The old block I'm referring to is Richard Monkton Mills. More so than everything, he was cut in his image. But you know, they've got this heritage, this aristocratic heritage, where some of the key events of the world are intersecting with the interests of them and side by side with the mining community, which is what I want to move on to. One road in, one road out, over the railway bridge. Someone very famously referred to it as a mining Shangri-La. And I love that description of it, of Fryston, because it rose, you know, in the late 1980s, was completed around about 1920, 12 streets if you count, you know, Smith cottages, and in many ways the quintessential mining community. You know, it was the pure mining community. Sociologists often talk about an ideal type mining community, geographically isolated, occupationally homogeneous, you know, all working in mining or related. Clear gender demarcation, the men working, the women doing unpaid, you know, arduous work in support of them, raising kids. On the other hand, you've got close kinship ties, very dense networks of people all from the same family, self-sufficiency. In Fryston, in those days, they'd got 2 chapels. You'd got a church, St. Peter's, just on the periphery. You've got a cooperative store and, what do they call it? Sells cloth and all that palaver. I was going to say livery, but that's horses, isn't it? Anyway, whatever you said, friend, I agree. I didn't hear you, but I agree with you. There you go. You know, and they've got the fish shop, they've got the butchers. They've got an informal bookie, you know, who took bets. They've got their own transport, buses, you know, within the village, owned within the village. They've got ferries across to Newton, from the Milnes Arms, their own pub, and across to Brownridge, Fairburn. They've got an informal economy, someone to fix your bike, someone to sell your pickles, someone to break cakes. They've got their own morgue, and they've got attendants from their own morgue sat outside near the railway buildings. Some people said, you know, the Frank Metcalfe in his speech, he said, some people never went to Castleford, there was no need. It was all there. But there was a certain spirit there. There were certain rituals, the chapel anniversary, the annual gala, you know, the various societies. And all of this made for a very thriving community. And I'm going to say more about the nature of work a bit in a little bit. But that was Fryston, and I don't want to. Lots of you will know more about Fryston, I promise you, know more about Fryston than I do. You know, people will say, they'll have their own experiences. And just talking to Dora, as I did during the pandemic, I could have written a book based on what she said. You know, she used to, for example, go deliver meat for Cuddy Bateson when she was 13 throughout the village. I didn't know that. Cuddy Bateson occupies key sections during the strike. I'll mention them in a minute, during the strike, in the book. So in the book, I talk about the strikes that shaped the nature of the community. I've just mentioned Cuddy Bateson. He was one of several people. There's a chapter in there, for example, on the general strike. This is a strike that encompassed 2 years, going from October 1902 to January 1904. And it was led, quite interestingly, by a guy called Herbert Smith, the famous miners' president, first of all of Yorkshire, then of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain. Herbert Smith was the miners' leader along with A.J. Cook during the general strike. But there are other strikes. There were strikes, major strikes in 1912. There were strikes in Fryston and Welldale in the World War. There were strikes in the early 1920s, but the most famous, and I devote a whole chapter in the book, 1926, where the hardship involved was excruciating. But the resourcefulness comes to the fore, and the values of community that were perhaps best exemplified, you know, not just by the people who dug coal out of the coal tips and sold them to salts of Saltaire who came in under the cover of darkness. You know, the board of guardians who sort of were giving people a pittance and a bag of buns to live on and some free shoes. But the local retailers, people like the Firths who ran the cooperative store. Cuddy Bateson was a butcher, set pot, bits of fat, meat, whatever went in there, but it was nourishing. Then you got the Rickabys, the teachers, providing cigarettes, you know, or plugs of tobacco, or you name it. Kids at school, making sure they were well clothed. And it was the nature of community, but it was, ironically enough, it was endorsed by others. And you got heroism within the community. Some will probably know about the guy on the right, not necessarily the guy on the left. The guy on the left is someone called Reginald Soar. He was one of 3 boys raised by Hezekiah Soar, who was the pit manager at Fryston, and his wife, Catherine, who came from Wales, 3rd wife. At the outset, not the outset, into the war, Reggie, who he's called, joined the Royal Navy Air Squadron. Went in these sort of biplanes and the Sopwith pups and what have you, they called them. And he became a fighter ace. Born and raised in... I talked to people, I said, what was he like? Can you remember? Yeah, I can remember him. Swell fella. They all played football. One of them had trials with Leeds City. You know, they weren't like managers' boys. You know, they were just like the rest of us. And he downed 12 German aircrafts in his career. Became well decorated. The guy on the right was born the same year as my granddad in 1893. Called him John Whetton. One of 13 in the family. One of his brothers died at the Somme. John, he joined one of the Scottish border regiments. Went and fought at Loos. Half even more of his regiment were cut down in action. He survived. Went to the Somme and got severely wounded. Had to be taken back to Britain. Retrained as a captain. Rejoined the conflict as a captain in the army at Passchendaele. But it was in the Second World War that he came to the fore. He trained up as a surveyor and as a mining engineer. And he was in County Durham when they called, the Ministry of Defence called him and said, you're reputed to be pretty astute at surveying methods. Can they be applied in a military context? He said, I'll give it a go. Sooner rather than later, he'd got this squadron that went out to the battlefields, you know, with their tech drawing instruments and other more sophisticated stuff, which I'm not qualified to talk about, and they applied modern survey techniques to pinpointing locations of enemy by collecting data on the nature of explosives and things like that. And their coordinates showed the British and the Allies where to aim their ammunition, their artillery. And boy, it was fundamental. He was given an OBE when he came out. The French awarded him the Croix de Guerre. And guess what? He went back as an academic. He was given a professorship at Leeds University and eventually rose to the exalted position, the highest position in a university, Vice-Chancellor of Leeds University. Fryston lad from 13 kids. What else can I tell you? Well, things changed a wee bit with the arrival in Fryston of this guy, Jim Bullock. Came as a pony boy from Bowers Row. He'd fallen out of favour. They didn't like the way that he was boxing, and he could swear a bit as well. And they were all religious minded. And he just had an offer to come in and break in the Welsh ponies at Fryston Pit, which he took up gladly. Arrived around about 1921, Fryston. Straight away had a galvanising effect. Took his deputy exams, and that was on the way to becoming an under-manager and the eventual manager of Pitt in 1938, but he set up a lot of sporting endeavours. And also, he wrote things like scripts for pantomimes and things like that. Played Scrooge in Christmas Carol. But this is where it gets a bit tasty as far as we're concerned today, because one of the things was, during the general strike, which I've mentioned, a young fella went up. His father was a Surrey stockbroker, and he went up to County Durham. He too had experienced this calling from the Lord, and he went up and he became a curate in County Durham, and the local Geordie people loved him. So all the women called him, "Come here, have a cup of tea, Mahini." During the general strike, he said, one of the first terrible duties I had to do was to arrange the funeral service for a guy who'd starved himself to death because he wouldn't eat while there was no food on the table for his wife and kids, and he starved to death. He said, but around about 1929, I was beckoned forward by Bishop of Durham, I think it was either Bishop of Durham, Bishop of Wakefield. I'm going to ask something of you. There's a new parish in Airedale, Fryston, Downwell area. We want you to build it, we want you to develop it. we want you to construct a church. He came down here, he said, he confesses to feeling scared. He says, the Geordies were one thing. He says, but I was scared stiff of what the Yorkshire people might do to me. And he soon discovered he got £300 to spend creating this church. Not a lot to build a church with. He went to the Shambles in York, and there was no chance of him getting the stone. They wouldn't give permission. It was a derelict building. He wanted to bring it all the way back. One day he's walking through Fryston Woods, and he sees the remains of Fryston Hall, which had lain derelict since it had been abandoned by the people who owned it just after Lord Crewe, John Austin, who was a brewer, and his sons. The building was still partly intact. The stables were there, etc. And he went with a Rover Scout and he saw this. And he obtained permission. As long as the church can nominate the architect and what have you, and you can get the labour involved, and it doesn't cost more than £300 to all order. And as many people will know, it's legendary in these parts. You know, local mining families. Jim Bullock takes a lot of credit for it. I can believe it, you know, but the manager of Glassalton donated bricks that he'd felt, towers with smokestacks and things like that. Lots of people volunteered. Daly drove the pickup truck and things like that. And lo and behold, we see this magnificent church rising. And it's the intersection. It is the spiritual heart, not just of our heritage, but of the book as well. You know, along with half a chapter on the Pithead Baths in Fryston, where Jim Bullock rigged the ballot to ensure that miners voted in favour of it. You've got the holier rise of the Holy Cross Church, where you've got the porticos at the front, and other concrete artefacts. And you got the stone that was the foundation stone that was laid from the Beeston seam at Fryston Colliery by none other than Lord Crewe, who came back in 1931, I think it was, you know, and there was a great celebration. He was coming, he was 13 years from the end of his life, very long life, but he came and it was celebrated. And there's an account of it in the book. So on the back of this stupendous feat, Fryston never seemed out of the news. You'll know, some of you will know on the left there, some of the Fryston Bevan boys that were brought during the war and afterwards. They were employed not just to sort of raise the fortunes of the local football team, but also in a charitable endeavour. Jim Bullock organised concert parties. My cousin and other relatives are in here. I had an uncle by marriage, a guy called Les Aplin, and he came up and he was one of the leaders of these bands. He wrote a very well-known, much-loved song that was well received in Normanton and Nottingley and Kippocks and all these places where this travelling band of brothers went to raise money, and they called it the Broken-Backed Miner. And it always got a rousing applause. So there's a family connection in this. But what they did was they utilised it initially to get disabled carriages, I beg your pardon, for the disabled miners, then to buy things for their relatives, to help the carers, send them on holiday, etc. And it became a kind of prototype for wider society and the wider coalfields. Fryston miners famously dug out and developed their own sport. Jim Bullock's ambition was to have White City, athletics track of the north. Fryston miners and their supporters created their own welfare hall within 13 days. Not long after, in this same sort of 2 or 3 year period, you got the rescue of Jim Winterbottom by Lister Addy. Winterbottom at the time, lived next door to my grandma and granddad in Fryston, and the family. And he says, I interviewed him, he said, it was bloody cold then, I was there. Has there ever been in a pit shaft? I said, no, he says. I said to him, Lister, by God, I'm glad to see thee. And it was Lister Addy who shinned down the rope, as many people will know, and he got the George Medal for it. That's him and his wife, Buckingham Palace, receiving the George Medal. Now, not long afterwards, Bullock left Fryston. He employed as his housekeeper a woman called Dora, and I want to get this in. Dora was my auntie. Knock at the door on Brook Street one day, Mrs. Bullock, I think they called her Jay. Dora liked to come and help look after the kids and look after the house for us, which she did. But Bullock went away from Fryston, very famously became president, one of the founding members and president of the British Association of Colliery Management. Sounds a bit of a right-wing organisation, except that. Because he was sort of fated as by lots of his friends were members of the Yorkshire Miners' Union. The miners' leaders he was friends with, and he was commonly fated as Britain's only socialist pit manager. And what Bullock did was ensure the rise and the prestige of BACM, as it was called, the acronym, but also that when you get to the time of the miners' strike, it shifted very much to the left. Jim Bullock retired in 1969, just before those strikes, the miners' union. Now, people often say it was the miners' strike that killed Fryston. It was a slower death than that. In the 50s, 1950s, just around the time I was born anyway, you got the deconstruction of the low buildings, the iconic low buildings, the back-to-backs, with their outside, rows of outside toilets at the bottom of the pit entrance. They were removed. You got decaying, you got the rise of estates in Ferry Fryston, and as I've said, Shepherd. You got people moving out, finding pastures new. The allotments were taken away. So you got a situation slowly over the next decade or so, two decades, where you got a situation where the pit was becoming very technologically sophisticated. Under the management of Edgar Williams, new technologies were being brought in. New underground transport and what have you. But Fryston, as I say, through the 70s, you get to by the time you got to the strike of the 1980s, only recently the NUM had to lobby in Fryston. There was an idea that either we spend a lot of money on the houses or we bring them down and rehouse people elsewhere. It wasn't long afterwards where the school closed, but due to the lobbying of the NUM and sympathetic local councillors, they said, well, we believe it can be saved. But you got the miners' strike itself. Without going into too much detail, and you know, we saw Ian McGregor at Pontefract visiting the strike breaker, Michael Fletcher. I interviewed lots of people, interviewed Brian Dakin, the NUM delegate, learned that he'd been, for example, fundraising in Canada. Not many people realise that he brought back thousands of pounds from sympathetic Canadian trade unions. So there's a marvellous effort. Women support groups, etc. Fryston had its riots during when Fletcher and others went back and people got to know about it. All of that's in the book. So, but it would be a misnomer to say, it would be misleading to say that it was the strike and its aftermath that finished Fryston. What you got was the closure of Fryston Colliery in December 1984, and within a couple of years, the taking down of the headgear. Now, almost ironically, beyond that, Fryston was generating its own publicity due to the interventions of, say, the Yorkshire Art Circus, who found that this amateur photographer, Jack had this trove of photographs depicting life in former decades in a mining community, in Fryston in particular. Harry Malkin, Fryston, ex-Fryston miner with a talent for painting. So you got this growth of kind of publicity for Fryston. Now, whether or not that helped, I don't know. But subsequently, and I'm rushing things a bit because I know that I've been talking a long time, Fryston, you couldn't make it up, could you really? You know, Channel 4 and Talkback Television, they decided to make a programme on regeneration. And where did they settle? They settled in Castleford, but not only that, there was this project in Fryston. You know, Martha Schwartz came in. And I've just been taking my family down and showing them round Fryston, and I showed them the iconic cairn, the three stones in the play area there, and I explained how, and I've done a big number on this. I've looked into the intended symbolism. I've gone to Martha Schwartz's company and I've looked into it and I've said, what was all the symbolism about this? And she said, well, you know those steps? She said, that's an amphitheatre. So that when they have open air theatre in Fryston, yeah, they're gonna all sit there in the manner of old, whereby they all sat on the steps. Okay, I'll buy that, yeah. What about this? She says, it's aspirational. She says, I want the community to point to the sky. The sky's the limit. And of course, you know, there's a well-publicised thing that said that Martha wasn't well received in Fryston. And actually, that thing is referred to as Martha's finger. So there's a chapter on Martha's finger in the book, which I invite you to read about. Now I'm coming to a close, but I want to do just a couple of things in a postscript. Your starter for 10 is, who is the guy in the picture? Listen mate, can you buzz when you answer it? And also, can you stand up so it looks like you're in a row higher than the other? Right? Correct. Bamber Gascoigne. Why is he in the photograph? What's he got to do with Fryston? Well, Mary, Duke of Roxburgh, that was her great nephew, also a godson. She had no children of her own, so when it came to bequeathing her final legacy, and this included lots of the paintings, lots of the artefacts from Fryston Hall, from when Lord Crewe was the British ambassador in Paris, paintings by the pre-Raphaelites, masses of books, etc. They all went to Bamber and his wife. Now, being the good egg that he is, he said, what I'm going to do, I'm going to have an auction at Sotheby's. There was this massive auction, and all these things from the Crewe heritage, the Crewe legacy and the Milnes legacy were sold off to pay for the restoration of West Horsley Place. And bless him, what Bamber and his wife decided to do was to bequeath it to the nation as an artistic and cultural centre and conference centre, the centrepiece of which was a 900-seater operatic theatre, and under the orchestra pit he scattered the ashes of his benevolent great aunt, Mary. So West Horsley in Surrey is the final resting place for the treasures of Fryston Hall, but with one exception. The majority of the books Mary held back. She said, what I want, she says, Lord Houghton, Lord Crewe were both undergraduates at Cambridge University. So there is now a Crewe collection of all the books once belonging to Fryston Hall in Cambridge University. So if you want to know more about those books, then apply to Cambridge University and they will gladly show you them. Now those are the resting places. That's Fryston today, and that's Fryston Hall and where it ended up. What I want to do, just briefly, is to say, well, I hope I haven't depersonalised this too much. And if I have, just in case I want to go back, and I want to talk about the nature of these two people. I might end up in tears, but please forgive me if I do. One of the generals, one of the leading generals, General Haig I think it was, he said, if you're going to give me a soldier, send me a miner. He says, why? He says, because, he says, they're used to working in teams. They're loyal. They have the mindset on a specific objective. He says, they're steady in a crisis. They deal with explosions. They work through injuries. They got the job done and they've got all these tools. You know, they can dig trenches, they dig tunnels, they can lay track, etc. They've got a versatility unknown elsewhere in the British Army. My granddad was in the 12th Coily. In many ways, he embodied what a Fryston miner was about by his conduct in the war. The 12th Coily was a miners' battalion. And as I say, he was in the Somme. And part of his job, part of all the miners' job, was to do the very thing that I've just described, digging trenches, digging tunnels underneath the enemy in some cases, but also laying track for vital reinforcements, vital supplies of ammunition and food and what have you. And occasionally, more often than not in fact, there were what occurred breaks in these lines, so that the enemy deliberately targeted the rails, boom, 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 holes, and you couldn't get the trains and the transport vessels up. So they called on volunteers. And these volunteers were told, I'm not going to lie to you. You go out there, fix, you'll be doing a great service to your fellow soldiers and your country. But I'm going to say this, there's only a 10% chance that you're going to come back alive. I want volunteers. This guy did it twice. Went out and did it twice and he got a DCM. Not just for that, it said, through his good humour, this man was one of the mainstays of his regiment. He was fundamental in keeping morale at a high point for the duration of the conflict. Now, afterwards, didn't come and collect your medal, Sam, along with others. Castleford Theatre Royal didn't go. My auntie reckons it was because he was too shy. I think it was too much fuss. They didn't like that. They didn't like blowing their own trumpet. And I like it. It frustrates me like hell, but I like it. What happened to his medal then, Auntie Dora? He gambled it away in a game of cards. Fabulous. But that was the nature. And in many ways, it was the same as, or no different. You know, from the people who we are talking about in Fryston Village and Airedale and other mining communities. And this woman here, you know, Janet was telling me the other day, she sat down in her knees in front of the fire during the general strike, praying to God that something would turn up. And about 2 hours later, a letter from the Board of Governors came through. And it contained some vouchers to redeem at a shop in Airedale. But all those kids, they say, you know, I baked 8 loaves of bread so that they could take it with their snap, and 8 more loaves of bread so that they could, when they, you know, women like that. Everybody called her ma'am. You know, when somebody's own mother was ill, can I stay with you, ma'am? Can I sleep overnight, ma'am? You know, it's a life of drudgery. And I'd be the first to say, it's, you know, looking back through the lens of history, it was appalling that women's lives were so constrained and restricted. But the fact of the matter is, within those restrictions, the emphasis on providing, the emphasis on keeping the home afloat, the emphasis on, tearing the shirt off the bloke and treating the carbuncles that he got from the thin seam, or putting a bandage on the dislocated knee so that he could go. This is what the life of drudgery that a woman involved. And if I look at some of the iconic characters, I've talked about them in the general strife, you might recognise some of these faces. The cute little guy in the middle is a bloke called Richard Sloane, who I happen to know is in this, and he wrote me, I want to say publicly, he wrote a smashing forward for the book. My Auntie Elsie worked in service, the domestic service, for the guy on the left there, who was Richard's father, George Sloane, who came to Fryston in 1923. We've all referred to him as the beloved Dr. Sloane. He was kindness, he was a friend. He seldom asked to be paid. If he was paid, it might be a plate of egg and chips by the fire. He'd stop and play Ludo. When somebody couldn't afford it, and this was pre-NHS, when somebody couldn't, then he waived the fee. He ended up, because he was so timid about it and reluctant to spoil his friendships, he eventually hired a bloke to go round and collect his fees for him, because he didn't have the heart to do it. And his second wife there, Richard's mother, Gerda Sloane, was a refugee from Nazi Germany during the war. She was cut from the same cloth. Fryston people took her to heart. It was about community. It was about selflessness. It was about sharing. It was about mutuality and common endeavour. Egalitarianism. And I remember interviewing a blind couple called Fred and Christine Stevens many years ago. And they got together and she says, we wouldn't be together, David. She says, if it wasn't for Dr. Gerda, as they called her, Dr. Gerda. Right? She says, because our parents were dead set against it. They'll never cope. And she said, give them a chance. They deserve it. They might be blind, but they love each other. She says, and we prospered with her help. So you had that sort of gun. When the NHS service came, many local doctors were against it. But what did the Sloanes do? First of all, they brought in record numbers of patients, which came to sign on from other surrounding practices, and they prescribed only the best for their patients. They were brought to book by the BMA and everybody, Why are you prescribing something? Ignore it, give them the best. If they want a sick note, we know them. We know they don't. So again, you get a situation where the people who loom largest in the folklore are the people who reciprocate those values within the mining communities, who know what the mining communities like Fryston are all about. Just to titillate you with a couple of things. I don't know how many of you remember George Box. I know Liz, his daughter, is in the but there's George Box, well-known hairdresser from Sager Street. I missed a key element here. That lady on the left, the equally beloved Nurse Box, the midwife, used to fly around with, her robes. She was married to a miner. I think he was a Fryston miner. Developed a tumour. He was told he'd got 9 months to live for a further 9 years. But she became the midwife. Once upon a time, she delivered practically all the babies in Airedale and Fryston. Where are we going to put him or her? I've got an idea then. And she'd empty a dressing table, drawer, make up a bed. There you are. Keep it there till I fetch something better for you. What are we going to pay you in? Have you got any currant tea cakes? Yeah, they'll do. So she too reciprocated. My apologies for missing her first time round. But you've got a situation there. Now, as I say, you've got George Box cutting George Sloane's hair. That's the beloved Dr. Sloan, Nurse Boxer's son, cutting his hair. And over on the right, one of the Fryston galas. After my mum had died, and I was looking through all her possessions, I came across this cutting of paper, and could it? Is it? Are we sure? Might it be? And I've passed it round by common consensus. That's Gerda Sloan in the middle, with her dishing out a prize, and the tall, dark-haired woman in the background, looking fed up with Tony Curtis chasing her all over the place. It was my mum. So as I say, it kind of comes full circle. When Ian was taking some pictures of Harry Malkin's portrait, there's Les Oxtoby, father of some well-known people in this in this hallowed place, and a white-haired vagrant sort of wandered into the shop as well while he was taking the... But what I did notice on there, I looked at it and I said, Ian had said, I think Cuddy Bateson's in this. And I said, no. Cuddy Bateson was dead long ago. He says, well, Harry Malkin reckons it was... And I looked. My auntie Dora used to work for that. I'm sure it is. I don't know if any of you remember George Clark and Alice Clark. Oh, well, please yourselves. And I seemed to recognise the face. Now, we went down, Ian and I went down to Fryston to do this photograph for an article in the Yorkshire Post. And we were down there, and I expected to feel really dismal and depressed. And I went round and I saw Fryston as the old part of the village. You walked in it, and there was enough there to feel nostalgic about. There was enough there to go back in time, to feel for the place. But it's as someone who knew it in its glory. And what, otherwise when you get the, bless them, and I'm not one to criticise, but you get, Kingfisher Close and Starling Way and all this, I'm making it up, but some of the names. Somebody come in there would be forgiven for not realising that this was a pit village. Not just any pit village. This was the iconic, quintessential pit village. Now, to go back to the start, I always felt that when I got the chance, probably when I retired, I was not just going to feed off the culture, the heritage that sustained me, that's made me walk tall. I was going to feed back into it. I was going to help perpetuate, refashion, refine, because it just doesn't belong to me or those people. It belongs to practically everybody here. And it should be a source of pride. And not just that, but also that parallel history. That parallel history of aristocrat, benevolent aristocracy. If you're going to have aristocrats, then let them show some kindness and philanthropy. And that's what we had. So what I'm appealing to you to do, one way or another, if you can get hold of the books, bless you. Not necessarily paying, borrow, go to the library, whatever, but read about it. Because you'll see your own faces in there. And if you've got anything about it, and I have every reason to believe you have, then you'll pass it on to the next generation. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and it's been one of the best days of my life. Thank you.
I just want to say a really big thank you for Dave for his presentation today. Do stay behind, enjoy free cakes, free coffee. There are photographs to see on the boards, but also there are over 200 photographs that are going to play also, which are different from the boards on the PowerPoint. Do go along to the back, because I know Dave's publishers are set up at the back there, and if you haven't got a copy of Dave's book, I can thoroughly recommend it. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it myself, and I'm really enjoying it. But once again, I think we owe Dave a big thank you.
It's been a great pleasure, and if you do get a chance, please come and talk to me, share your reminiscences, tell me who you are. I can't wait to hear. Take care. Thank you.